in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln spoke of the duty of the patriot in an hour of decisive crisis for the American people. Fellow citizens, he said, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Even we here, he said, hold the power and bear the responsibility. In the Bible, St. Paul wrote, think on these things. We must think on what Lincoln told us. Even us here, hold the power and bear the responsibility.
What's going on, everybody? John here. The Capitol is witnessing unprecedented institutional fury as Congress turns its most powerful constitutional weapon against the sitting president. This is not policy debate. It's a defining moment that will force every lawmaker to make a lasting choice. The kind of moment where the word impeachment stops being a theoretical concept discussed in constitutional law classes and becomes a very real, very immediate threat to the person occupying the Oval Office. And here's the thing that makes this story truly remarkable. This isn't some isolated incident that happened once and faded away. This is a recurring pattern, a documented historical thread that runs through multiple years of Trump's presidency, resurfacing again and again like a force of political nature that simply refuses to be extinguished. Every single time lawmakers start talking about resignation or impeachment, it feels like the entire country is holding its breath.
We, you and I, hold in trust the power that derives most directly from the people of the United States. And we bear the responsibility to fill that oath that we all swear before God and before one another. The oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, so help us God. We know that we faced enemies of the Constitution. We know we experienced the insurrection that violated the sanctity of the people's capital and attempted to overturn the duly recorded will of the American people. And we know that the President of the United States incited this insurrection, this armed rebellion against our common country. He must go. He is a clear and present danger to the nation that we all love. Since the presidential election in November, an election the president lost, he has repeatedly lied about the outcome, sowed self-serving doubt about democracy, and unconstitutionally sought to influence.
Like we're standing on the edge of something that could fundamentally reshape American governance. And honestly, the real documented history here, the actual events that unfolded across multiple years, is already dramatic enough to make your head spin without needing any exaggeration or sensationalism. Let's start with the undeniable reality of what actually happened. When the breach occurred at the Capitol during the certification of the presidential election, the shockwaves that rippled through Congress were unlike anything most lawmakers had ever experienced. These were people who had spent their careers in the building, who had walked those hallways thousands of times, who had always assumed that the institution they served in was somehow protected from the kind of violence they'd seen in other countries.
State officials to repeal reality. And then came that day of fire we all experienced. The president must be impeached, and I believe the president must be convicted by the Senate, a constitutional remedy that will ensure that the Republic will be safe from this man who was so resolutely determined to tear down the things that we hold dear and that hold us together. It gives me no pleasure to say this. It breaks my heart. It should break your heart. It should break all of our hearts. For your presence in this hallowed chamber is testament to your love for our country, for America, and to your faith in the work of our founders to create a more perfect union. Those insurrectionists were not patriots. They were not part of a political base to be catered to and managed. They were domestic terrorists, and justice must prevail. But they did not appear out of a vacuum. They were sent here by the president with words such as a cry to fight like hell. Words matter.
And then, in a matter of hours, that assumption was shattered. The building was overrun. Lawmakers were hiding under desks. The certification process that had been proceeding peacefully just moments before was suddenly interrupted by chaos and fear. And when the dust settled, when the building was secured and lawmakers could finally catch their breath, the anger started to build. Not just anger, but a profound sense that something had fundamentally broken, that the line between legitimate political disagreement and something far more dangerous had been crossed. And that anger, that profound sense of institutional violation, didn't just dissipate. It transformed into concrete political action at a speed that stunned even seasoned Washington observers.
Truth matters. Accountability matters. In his public exhortations to him, the president saw the insurrectionists not as the foes of freedom, as they are, but as the means to a terrible goal, the goal of his personally clinging to power, the goal of thwarting the will of the people, the goal of ending in a fiery and bloody clash nearly 2.5 centuries of our democracy. This is not theoretical, and this is not motivated by partisanship. I stand before you today as an officer of the Constitution, a Speaker of the House of Representatives. I stand before you as a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a daughter whose father proudly served in this Congress, Thomas D'Alessandro Jr. from Maryland, one of the first Italian Americans to serve in the Congress. And I stand here before you today as the noblest of things, a citizen of the United States of America. With my voice and my vote, with a plea to all of you, Democrats and Republicans, I ask you to search your souls and answer these questions.
Within days, almost immediately after the breach, lawmakers started talking about the 25th Amendment. They started talking about resignation. They started talking about impeachment. Not as distant possibilities, but as immediate options that were being seriously considered at the highest levels of congressional leadership. And then came the most significant moment. Nearly 160 House Democrats signed their names to a formal article of impeachment. Let me repeat that number because it's genuinely staggering. 160 House Democrats, elected officials from districts all across the country, putting their names, their reputations, their political futures on the line by formally charging the sitting president with incitement of insurrection.
Is the president's war on democracy in keeping with the Constitution? Were his words an insurrectionary mob a high crime and misdemeanor? Do we not have the duty to our oath to do all we constitutionally can to protect our nation and our democracy from the appetites and ambitions of a man who has self-evidently demonstrated that he is a vital threat to liberty, to self-government, and to the rule of law? Our country is divided. We all know that. There are lies abroad in the land spread by a desperate president who feels his power slipping away. We know that too. But I know this as well, that we here in this House have a sacred obligation to stand for truth, to stand up for the Constitution, to stand as guardians of the Republic. In a speech he was prepared to give in Dallas on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was to say, "We in this country, in this generation, are, by destiny rather than choice."
Those words, incitement and insurrection, are not casual language. They're not political buzzwords designed to generate attention. They are specific legal terms that carry enormous constitutional weight. And when lawmakers attach those words to a formal impeachment article, they are making a judgment that the president's conduct rose to the level of the most serious offense imaginable. This wasn't some symbolic gesture designed to make a political point. This was the House of Representatives, one of the two chambers of Congress, formally moving toward using its most powerful constitutional check on presidential power. And it happened with a speed that reflected the intensity of the moment. Lawmakers who might normally hesitate to embrace something as dramatic as impeachment felt compelled to act quickly because what had happened at the Capitol felt like a direct assault on the institution they served in. But here's where the story takes an even more significant turn. This wasn't a one-and-done moment. The push for removal didn't simply fade into history after the immediate aftermath of the Capitol breach. Years later, after Trump had been inaugurated for his second term, Congress found itself confronting the same fundamental questions all over again. In 2025, the House introduced another formal impeachment resolution against Trump. That's not a rumor, that's not speculation, that's a documented fact. A separate, later action entirely distinct from the January 6th aftermath. Think about the significance of that for a moment. We're talking about two entirely separate formal impeachment efforts against the same president, separated by years, occurring in two different terms of office, triggered by different specific controversies. That's never happened before in American history. Not once. The fact that Congress felt compelled to reach for its most serious constitutional tool, not once, but twice against the same person, tells you something profoundly important about the depth of the institutional conflict that has characterized Trump's entire time in office. It's not about one particular event that sparked outrage and then faded. It's about a sustained, ongoing pattern of tension between the executive branch and significant parts of the legislative branch that simply refuses to be resolved. Now, let's talk about what impeachment actually means in practical terms. Because understanding the mechanics of the process helps explain just how significant these moments truly are. Impeachment begins in the House of Representatives, where a simple majority vote is needed to formally charge the president with specific offenses. That's the impeachment itself, the formal act of charging the president with wrongdoing. But removal from office, the actual consequence that everyone focuses on, requires a separate process in the Senate. The Senate holds a trial, and conviction requires a 2/3 majority vote. That's an extraordinarily high bar, one that the founders intentionally set because they wanted removal to be difficult, something that required broad consensus across party lines, not something that could be done lightly every time one party controlled Congress and disagreed with the president. And history shows just how rare successful removal has been. No president in American history has ever been removed from office through impeachment and Senate conviction. Some have been impeached by the House, like Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, but they were acquitted in the Senate and remained in office. Richard Nixon resigned before the House could vote on impeachment. So the process itself, even without a successful Senate conviction, carries enormous historical weight. It means the House, the body that represents the people most directly, formally voted that the president's conduct constituted an impeachable offense. That's not nothing. That's a significant institutional statement that becomes part of the historical record. And think about what it means for individual lawmakers when they sign onto an impeachment article. It's not like casting a vote on a routine piece of legislation that will be forgotten by next week. Signing onto an impeachment article is a career-defining moment. It's a decision that will be scrutinized by historians, by political scientists, by voters in their districts, by their own party leadership. It's a decision that can determine whether they get reelected, whether they receive leadership positions, whether they're remembered as heroes or villains by different factions of the electorate. So when nearly 160 House Democrats signed onto that article of impeachment, charging incitement of insurrection, they weren't doing it casually. They were making a calculated decision that the situation was serious enough to justify the professional and political risks. And that calculation was shaped by the immediate trauma of the Capitol breach. They weren't responding to a distant policy dispute. They were responding to an event that had directly endangered their own lives and the lives of their staff members. That personal experience, that shared trauma, is part of what drove the speed and intensity of the response. But let's also think about Speaker Nancy Pelosi's role in all of this. As the Speaker of the House, Pelosi occupied one of the most powerful positions in American government. She wasn't some backbencher making noise for attention. She was the leader of the House, the person responsible for setting the legislative agenda and guiding her party's priorities. When she publicly stated that impeachment remained on the table if Trump didn't resign first, that wasn't offhand commentary. That was a deliberate, calculated statement designed to signal just how seriously the situation was being taken at the highest levels of congressional leadership. Pelosi wasn't floating impeachment as some distant theoretical possibility. She was saying, in effect, that the only two options on the table were resignation or impeachment. There was no third option. There was no quiet back-channel resolution. There was no hoping the problem would simply go away. The institutional pressure was being applied directly and publicly. And the message was unmistakable. Either the president steps down voluntarily, or Congress will move to remove him through the formal constitutional process. That's as serious as American politics gets. And the fact that it came from the Speaker herself, not from some fringe member of the House, tells you just how unified the Democratic leadership was on this issue in that specific moment. Now, let's shift our focus to the 2025 impeachment resolution, because this is the part of the story that tends to get overlooked. Most people remember the immediate aftermath of January 6th. Most people recall the impeachment push that followed. But far fewer people are aware that Congress went through this process again years later. And that's significant because it shows that the underlying concerns that drove the original impeachment effort never actually went away. They just got temporarily buried under other news cycles, other controversies, other pressing political issues. But they remained present, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right set of circumstances to bring them back to the forefront. And in 2025, those circumstances apparently emerged. A formal impeachment resolution was introduced in the House. That resolution wasn't some symbolic gesture that was immediately ignored. It was a serious document that required specific allegations, formal drafting, and enough political will to actually introduce it as an official resolution. The fact that it happened at all tells you that significant parts of the House still believed, years after the original crisis, that Trump's conduct had crossed serious lines that demanded constitutional accountability. And that's a remarkable statement about the persistence of institutional tension between Congress and this particular president. Let's take a step back and think about what all of this means for the broader health of American democracy. Impeachment exists as a check on presidential power for a reason. The founders, drawing on centuries of political experience and their own recent history with King George III, understood that executive power needed to be constrained by legislative authority. They understood that a president who crossed serious lines needed to be held accountable, even if that meant using the most extreme tool available. But they also understood that impeachment couldn't be used lightly. It couldn't become a routine political weapon. That's why they set the bar so high, requiring 2/3 of the Senate for conviction. That's why the process is so complex and time-consuming. They wanted impeachment to be available for genuine emergencies, not for everyday political disagreements. So when Congress reaches for that tool multiple times against the same president, that's a signal that something significant is happening. It's not about one isolated controversy that flared up and then subsided. It's about a sustained pattern of institutional concern that has persisted across multiple years and multiple different controversies. And here's another angle worth considering. Every time a formal impeachment effort happens, it forces every single member of Congress to go on the record. There's no hiding behind vague statements or careful non-answers. When a formal article of impeachment is sitting in front of you, lawmakers either sign on or they don't. They either vote yes or they vote no. That kind of forced accountability is exactly why these moments carry so much political weight. It's not just about the president facing consequences. It's about every lawmaker having to publicly decide where they stand on the most serious constitutional question imaginable. Those votes become part of the permanent historical record. They can't be walked back or explained away later. They're documented, public, and permanent. And that's why impeachment votes are so fraught with political danger. Lawmakers who vote yes risk alienating constituents who support the president. Lawmakers who vote no risk being seen as complicit in serious misconduct. There's no safe option. There's no way to avoid taking a stand. And that forced accountability is exactly what makes these moments so defining, both for the president facing impeachment and for every single lawmaker who has to decide where they fall on this fundamental question of constitutional governance. Now, think about how the public perceives all of this. Because public opinion matters enormously in moments of constitutional crisis. Impeachment may be a legal process, but it's also a deeply political one. Lawmakers are acutely aware of how their constituents feel about the president, about impeachment, about the specific allegations involved. When public opinion shifts dramatically against a president, it gives lawmakers political cover to support impeachment. When public opinion remains strongly supportive of the president, it makes lawmakers much more reluctant to take that step. And in the aftermath of the Capitol breach, public opinion was genuinely shaken. People across the country had watched the violence unfold on live television. They had seen the images of the building being overrun. They had heard the accounts of lawmakers hiding under desks. That shared national experience created a moment of genuine shock and outrage that made impeachment feel more politically viable than it might have otherwise been. And that's part of why the push toward impeachment moved so quickly. Lawmakers weren't just responding to their own anger. They were responding to the anger of their constituents, the people who had watched the same images and felt the same sense of violation. But here's the thing about public opinion. It's not static. It shifts and evolves over time. The outrage that felt so fresh and immediate in the days following the Capitol breach eventually faded, or at least became less concentrated. Other issues rose to the forefront of public consciousness. The constant churn of the news cycle brought new controversies, new debates, new pressing concerns. And by the time 2025 rolled around, the political environment was different. The immediate trauma of the Capitol breach was no longer at the forefront of most people's minds. But for significant parts of Congress, the underlying concerns that had driven the original impeachment push never fully disappeared. They persisted, sometimes quietly, sometimes in the background, but always present. And when new controversies emerged, when new specific allegations surfaced, those underlying concerns found new expression in the form of another formal impeachment resolution. That's the pattern that matters here. Not one single dramatic moment, but a recurring cycle of institutional tension that keeps bringing Congress back to the same fundamental question. Has this president crossed lines that require constitutional accountability? Now, let's think about what all of this means for the future. Because if the pattern we've documented here continues, there's every reason to believe that impeachment or resignation demands will resurface again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week. But at some point, when new controversies emerge that echo the same underlying concerns that lawmakers have raised before, Congress will once again find itself grappling with the same difficult questions. And that's the reality of American governance in an era of deep institutional conflict. Impeachment, once a rare and extraordinary tool, has become a recurring feature of the political landscape, not because it's being used casually or politically, but because the underlying tensions that drive it aren't getting resolved. They're just getting temporarily suppressed, waiting for the next trigger to bring them back to the surface. And here's something else to consider. The existence of this recurring pattern shapes the way everyone behaves. Presidents know that impeachment is a real possibility, not just a theoretical one. Lawmakers know that they might have to take a public stand on impeachment at any moment. The media knows that impeachment is a story that generates enormous public interest. The public knows that impeachment is a tool that can and will be used when serious lines are crossed. That awareness changes incentives, changes strategies, changes the way political actors calculate their moves. It's not just about any one specific impeachment effort. It's about the entire political environment being shaped by the knowledge that impeachment is a genuine, recurring possibility. So where does that leave us? We've got a documented pattern of Congress reaching for its most serious constitutional tool multiple times against the same president. We've got nearly 160 House Democrats signing on to an article of impeachment charging incitement of insurrection in the immediate aftermath of the Capitol breach. We've got the Speaker of the House publicly stating that impeachment was on the table if the president didn't resign first. We've got a separate formal impeachment resolution introduced years later in 2025. And we've got a recurring pattern of institutional tension that shows no clear signs of being fully resolved. That's the real story here. Not one single dramatic headline moment, not one isolated outburst of political anger, but a sustained, documented pattern of the legislative branch using its most extreme constitutional tool against the same president across multiple years, multiple controversies, and multiple specific political moments. The question that remains is whether this pattern will continue. Will Congress find itself debating impeachment again in the future? Will new controversies emerge that trigger the same institutional responses we've seen before? Based on everything we've documented here, it would be naive to assume that this tension has been permanently resolved. When the same accountability tool gets used more than once against the same person across different years and different specific controversies, that's usually a sign that the underlying issues haven't actually been addressed. They've just been waiting for the next trigger to bring them back into the headlines. And that's exactly why we're going to keep tracking this closely going forward. Because if history is any guide, this isn't the last time we're going to be having this conversation. Congress has shown a willingness to reach for impeachment when it believes serious lines have been crossed. And as long as the underlying tensions that drove those earlier impeachment efforts remain unresolved, there's every reason to believe that Congress will find itself reaching for that tool again when the circumstances warrant it. The real significance of all this extends far beyond any single political moment. It's about the fundamental relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. It's about the checks and balances that the founders built into the Constitution to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. When Congress repeatedly uses its most powerful check against the same president, that's not a sign of a healthy, functioning political system. It's a sign of deep institutional conflict that needs to be addressed. Whether you agree with the specific impeachment efforts or not, the existence of this recurring pattern tells you something important about the state of American governance. And that's the part that should stick with you long after this video ends. The real story isn't any single impeachment effort. It's the recurring pattern of institutional tension between Congress and the presidency. That cycle of conflict over constitutional accountability is still being written.